There was no scream, no witness, just an empty road, an open car door, and a town that would spend 30 years wondering who was responsible, until one quiet arrest changed everything. In 1994, Maple Ridge, Indiana was a town defined by familiarity. With fewer than 12,000 residents, it sat quietly between cornfields and county roads, a place where neighbors recognized each other's vehicles and strangers stood out. Crime existed, but it was distant, something that happened elsewhere, in cities people watched on the evening news. Serious violence was rare. Murder was almost unheard of. That illusion ended on the night of October 14, 1994. At the center of the case was Laura Bennett, a 32-year-old woman whose life followed a predictable rhythm. Laura had lived in Maple Ridge her entire life. She worked the early shift at Harlan's Family Diner, a modest roadside restaurant that catered to locals and long-haul drivers passing through State Road 39. She was known as reliable, quiet, kind, the type of person who avoided conflict and rarely drew attention to herself. She lived alone in a small ranch-style home a few minutes outside town and maintained close ties with her parents, who lived nearby. On Friday nights, Laura usually went straight home after work. On this particular Friday, she never made it. According to co-workers, Laura closed the diner just after 9:15 p.m. The evening had been uneventful. No arguments, no disturbances. She wiped down counters, counted the register, and locked the doors as she always did. One co-worker later recalled Laura mentioning she was tired and looking forward to sleeping in the next morning. She stepped into the parking lot alone. That was the last confirmed sighting of Laura Bennett alive. When Laura failed to show up for her shift the following morning, concern spread quickly. She was punctual to the point of habit. When phone calls went unanswered, her parents drove to her home. Nothing appeared disturbed. Her car was gone. Her purse was missing. There was no note, no explanation. By early afternoon, Maple Ridge police opened a missing person investigation. Within hours, the case took a darker turn. A county maintenance worker reported a vehicle abandoned along a gravel access road roughly 6 miles south of town. When officers arrived, they identified the car immediately. It belonged to Laura. The scene unsettled even experienced investigators. The driver's door stood open. The keys remained in the ignition. There were no skid marks, no signs of an accident. Inside, Laura's belongings were untouched. Her wallet sat in the center console. Her jacket lay folded on the passenger seat. There was no visible blood, no evidence of a struggle. It looked as though she had stopped and never returned. Search teams were deployed immediately. Indiana State Police joined local officers as volunteers scoured fields, drainage ditches, and wooded areas along nearby roads. Helicopters surveyed from above. Dogs were brought in to track scent trails that faded quickly in the cold October air. No trace of Laura was found. Days passed. Flyers appeared in store windows and gas stations. Candlelight vigils filled the town square. Tip lines rang constantly, but none of the information provided direction investigators could follow. Then, nearly 3 weeks later, on November 3, 1994, hikers walking near the Whitewater River noticed a strong odor coming from a wooded ravine beneath a trail. Authorities were called. What they found confirmed the community's worst fears. The remains were identified as Laura Bennett. The autopsy revealed she had been murdered. Investigators determined she had not died where she was found. Her body had been transported and concealed, suggesting intent and control rather than panic. Maple Ridge was no longer dealing with a disappearance. It was facing a homicide. The investigation intensified. Interviews multiplied. Every known connection in Laura's life was examined. Former relationships, co-workers, casual acquaintances, anyone who might explain why she stopped that night. But answers were elusive. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage, no digital trail. DNA was collected, but technology in 1994 offered limited options. Without a suspect for comparison, the samples could not identify a killer. As weeks turned into months, the momentum slowed. Despite exhaustive efforts, no arrest was made. And quietly, without ceremony, Laura Bennett's case began its long descent into uncertainty. A cold case, unsolved, but not forgotten. When Laura Bennett's body was recovered from the wooded ravine near the Whitewater River, investigators knew the case had reached a point of no return. What had begun as a frantic search for a missing woman was now a homicide investigation, one that demanded precision, restraint, and speed. The autopsy was performed at the Indiana State Forensic Laboratory within 48 hours of the discovery. Officials released only minimal details to the public, a decision made deliberately to protect the integrity of the case. Internally, however, the findings provided the first concrete answers and raised new questions. Laura had been killed within hours of her disappearance. The medical examiner determined that she did not die where her body was found. The condition of the remains and the lack of environmental debris suggested she had been transported after death. The ravine itself was steep, remote, and difficult to access without prior knowledge of the area. This was not a random dumping site. It appeared chosen. There were no defensive wounds on Laura's hands or arms, no evidence of a prolonged struggle. That absence suggested she may have been surprised or that the person responsible had exercised control quickly and decisively. Investigators also noted what was missing. There were no obvious ligature materials left behind. No weapon recovered at the scene. Whatever had been used to kill Laura had been taken with the perpetrator. Evidence technicians collected every trace they could: fibers, soil samples, biological material. In 1994, DNA analysis was possible but limited. Without a suspect to compare against, genetic material could only be preserved, not interpreted. Detectives understood its potential value, even if that value could not yet be realized. With the autopsy complete, investigators turned their attention fully to reconstructing Laura's final movements. They knew she had left Harlan's family diner just after 9:15 p.m. They knew her car was found 6 miles south of town, along a route she had no reason to travel. The question was why. One theory gained early traction: Laura had been followed. Detectives considered whether someone had observed her routine, waited for her shift to end, and trailed her until she was isolated. The diner's regulars were reviewed closely. Truckers who passed through frequently were questioned when possible. License plates noted in the parking lot that night were tracked down. Nothing connected. Another theory suggested Laura may have stopped voluntarily. Perhaps she recognized someone she knew, someone who waved her down, someone she trusted enough to pull over on a dark road. That possibility unsettled investigators. It implied the killer was not a stranger. Interviews expanded. Laura's co-workers were questioned multiple times, each interview carefully documented and compared for inconsistencies. Friends were asked about her personal life. Detectives examined whether Laura had been seeing anyone secretly or planning to meet someone that night. They found no evidence she was. Laura's life, by all accounts, was uncomplicated. She had no history of risky behavior, no debts, no conflicts that suggested motive. Her predictability, once comforting, now complicated the investigation. Without a clear suspect, detectives began working through a list of persons of interest. A former acquaintance who had briefly dated Laura years earlier was interviewed extensively. He provided an alibi that could not be conclusively disproven. A co-worker who had expressed interest in Laura was questioned, but phone records and witness statements placed him elsewhere that night. Another individual, a man known to loiter near the diner after closing, was scrutinized closely. His behavior was suspicious enough to warrant attention, but again, no physical evidence tied him to the crime. Each potential lead generated brief optimism. Each ended the same way: cleared. As the investigation continued, the volume of tips increased. Maple Ridge was a small town, and fear had a way of amplifying suspicion. Neighbors reported unfamiliar vehicles. Old grudges resurfaced. Anonymous callers accused acquaintances, co-workers, even family members. Investigators followed every credible lead, but the sheer number of tips began to overwhelm available resources. Time was spent chasing rumors instead of building solid evidence. As weeks passed without an arrest, frustration grew on both sides of the investigation. By early 1995, the case began to show signs of strain. Detectives were forced to prioritize newer cases with immediate threats to public safety. While Laura Bennett's motor remained open, it no longer commanded daily attention. The investigative team shrank. Leads were revisited less frequently. Momentum slowed. One of the most significant limitations was technology. In the mid-1990s, forensic science had not yet caught up to investigators' ambitions. DNA databases were small. Genetic matching required a known suspect or a close relative already in the system. Laura's case had neither. The evidence existed, but it could not speak. As months turned into years, the case settled into an uneasy limbo. Laura's parents continued to meet with detectives periodically. Each meeting followed a familiar pattern: a review of known facts, a discussion of potential avenues, and an acknowledgement that there was nothing new to report. They were thanked for their patience, assured the case had not been forgotten. But patience did not bring answers. By the late 1990s, the case was officially designated a cold case. This classification did not mean it was closed, but it reflected reality. Without new evidence or new witnesses, progress had stalled. Maple Ridge carried the weight of the unsolved crime quietly. Parents warned their children to be careful. Some residents insisted the killer must have been a transient, someone who passed through and vanished. Others feared the opposite, that the person responsible had blended back into the community unnoticed. No one knew which was worse. Over time, new detectives reviewed the file. Fresh eyes often bring fresh questions, and Laura's case was no exception. Some investigators wondered whether early assumptions had narrowed the scope too quickly. Others questioned whether certain interviews should have been revisited more aggressively. But without new information, these reflections led nowhere. The evidence remained sealed and preserved, catalogued according to standards that, unintentionally, would prove critical decades later. Biological samples were stored properly. Chain of custody records were maintained. Details that might have seemed insignificant in 1994 were documented thoroughly. Those decisions mattered. As the years passed, forensic science advanced dramatically. DNA analysis became more precise. Databases expanded. New techniques emerged that allowed investigators to identify suspects through distant genetic relationships rather than direct matches. For a long time, these advances passed Laura's case by. Funding limitations, staffing shortages, and competing priorities delayed any meaningful re-evaluation. Laura Bennett's name appeared occasionally in cold case summaries, anniversary articles, and internal audits, but always with the same conclusion: unsolved. By the early 2010s, Laura's parents were aging. Detectives who had worked the original investigation were retired. For many, the case had become a story from the past, a tragedy remembered but unresolved. Yet beneath the surface, the foundation for breakthrough already existed. The evidence was intact. The records were detailed, and science was closing the gap between what investigators once hoped for and what they could now achieve. All it would take was the right moment, and when that moment came, it would force the community of Maple Ridge to confront a truth it had avoided for nearly 30 years. The killer had not vanished. He had waited. For nearly 3 decades, Laura Bennett's case had existed in a state of suspension, preserved, reviewed, and quietly waiting. What ultimately changed its fate was not a confession, a witness, or a forgotten tip, but a shift in science that allowed investigators to ask a different question. Not who left the DNA, but who might be related to them. In early 2022, the Indiana State Police initiated a targeted review of long unsolved homicides that met strict criteria, preserved biological evidence, unresolved suspects, and the potential for forensic genealogy. Laura Bennett's case was placed on that list. The decision was not made lightly. Forensic genetic genealogy requires time, funding, and extensive cross-checking. It also demands caution. Partial matches can be misleading if not verified through traditional investigative work. Detectives understood that expectations needed to be managed, both internally and with Laura's surviving family. Still, the opportunity was undeniable. Biological samples collected in 1994 were sent to a specialized laboratory capable of extracting and amplifying genetic material using modern techniques. The results were not perfect. Decades of storage had taken their toll, but the profile was usable. For the first time, Laura's killer had a genetic fingerprint that could speak. That fingerprint was uploaded into publicly available genealogical databases used in law enforcement investigations. These databases do not return names. They return relationships, shared genetic markers that suggest common ancestry. Weeks passed, then months. Finally, analysts identified several distant familial connections clustered around the Midwest, including individuals with historical ties to southeastern Indiana. Investigators began building family trees backward, mapping generations, marriages, relocations, and deaths. The process was painstaking. Most branches were eliminated quickly. Ages didn't align. Locations didn't match. But one branch stood out. It led to a man who had lived in Maple Ridge in 1994. His name had appeared briefly in early investigative notes, not as a suspect, but as someone tangentially connected to Laura's world. At the time, there had been no evidence to pursue him further. He was cooperative. He blended into the background. And eventually, he moved away. Now, decades later, his proximity mattered. Detectives began rebuilding the case quietly. They confirmed the man's whereabouts in 1994. They reviewed employment records, addresses, and vehicle registrations. They compared his movements to Laura's known routine. They re-examined old interviews with fresh perspective. Nothing about the process was rushed. Surveillance was initiated. Trash was collected legally to obtain discarded DNA. When laboratory analysis confirmed that the genetic material matched the profile derived from the crime scene, investigators knew they were standing at the edge of something Maple Ridge had waited nearly 30 years to see. An answer. In the spring of 2024, authorities obtained an arrest warrant. The arrest did not happen in Indiana. The suspect had built a quiet life in a neighboring state. He had a job, a home, neighbors who described him as unremarkable. Nothing about his daily existence suggested the past investigators were now preparing to confront. When officers arrived at his residence, there were no sirens, no media waiting, just a knock on the door, and a moment that ended 3 decades of uncertainty. He was taken into custody without incident. The news reached Maple Ridge within hours. For a town that had learned to live with unanswered questions, the announcement felt unreal. People gathered outside the courthouse. Social media filled with disbelief, relief, and unease. The suspect's name was recognized by some, unfamiliar to others. For those who remembered 1994, the arrest forced a reckoning. The killer had not been an outsider passing through. He had been close enough to disappear into normal life. Laura Bennett's parents were notified privately before the arrest was made public. In a statement released through investigators, they expressed gratitude that the case had not been forgotten, even as they acknowledged the pain of reopening wounds they had spent decades learning to carry. "This does not bring Laura back," the statement read, "but it brings truth. And that matters." As the case moved through the legal system, prosecutors emphasized the strength of the forensic evidence, while acknowledging the challenges of a decades-old crime. Memories had faded. Witnesses were older. Some were no longer alive. But the science endured. The arrest sent ripples far beyond Maple Ridge. Nationally, the case became another example of how modern forensic techniques are reshaping the limits of justice. It reinforced a message investigators have repeated for years: time does not erase accountability. Evidence preserved carefully can speak, even decades later. For Maple Ridge, the resolution was complicated. There was relief, but also discomfort. The idea that the killer had lived freely for so long unsettled many. Conversations resurfaced. Old suspicions were re-examined. Some residents questioned whether the town had wanted answers, or simply closure. Laura Bennett's story was no longer just about a murder. It was about patience, about restraint, about the long arc of truth. The case also reshaped how law enforcement viewed unresolved homicides. Detectives involved in the investigation credited the original team's decision to preserve evidence meticulously, even when technology could not yet deliver answers. Those choices mattered. Today, Laura Bennett's name is no longer attached to the word unsolved. Her case stands as a reminder that cold cases are not dormant. They are waiting for science to advance, waiting for persistence to matter, waiting for the truth to surface. For the community of Maple Ridge, justice arrived not with spectacle, but with clarity. And for Laura, whose life was reduced for decades to a question mark, her story finally reached something it had been denied since 1994.